Chapter 3. That night, I had one of my recurring dreams. I was high up in the mountains, nothing but the sandy tones of orange and red rocks surrounding me. After glancing around, I walked forward a few paces to the edge of a cliff. It was incredibly lifelike for a dream. The expanse of the army base I lived on spread out across the plain below me, and I could feel the wind flowing through my hair. Then I turned my gaze towards the horizon and took one step too many, falling over the edge of the cliff. I was incredibly calm, arms automatically folding across my chest to streamline my body. Just before I was about to hit the ground, raven black wings sprouted from my back and turned my fall into a dive. Then I catapulted upwards from the momentum I'd gathered, flying out into the open sky. Soon, my dream took a turn from the usual. The horizon darkened, and within seconds, I was skimming over a sea of storm clouds, lightning crackling beneath me. There were a few seconds where everything seemed deceptively calm. Even the lightning had stopped. Then, without warning, strange creatures appeared out of the storm. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, almost like ghosts, as they could fly and their bodies weren't humanoid. But they seemed to be made out of a dark substance that was neither a liquid nor a gas. If I had to name the substance, I would say that it was darkness itself. If their bodies were like a liquid or gas, then their eyes and mouths were like holes or depressions, not unlike the whirlpool that forms when you drain a bathtub. As more and more of them appeared, the strange shifting of their bodies made the air around me shimmer and gave me the impression I was underwater. It was disorienting enough that I closed my eyes for a moment, only to reopen them and find that I was flying in the middle of a full-scale battle. Beams of light were being shot in every direction, and I was forced to dodge and weave in the air to keep from getting hit. Assuming I could get hit, that is. It was a dream, after all. Eventually, I spotted Zed in the chaos. The same purple sparks I'd seen him use earlier were dancing around his wings. I didn't see any immediate purpose for it, so I assumed they helped him fly. His silver bow was in hand, and he was shooting down the creatures with arrows made of some sort of energy, maybe magic, or light. This was made easier by the fact that he was somehow flying upright, as if he were standing on an invisible platform. Amid everything else, I somehow made time to notice that he was wearing a dark blue pair of jeans and a purple muscle shirt, and that he looked extremely good in them. Another angel appeared out of nowhere and raced past me, getting close enough to brush my cheek with a white wingtip. He could have been Zed's twin. They looked exactly alike, if you could get past the pigmentation. The second angel's eyes were as blue as the sky on a sunny day, his wings as white as any clouds that might choose to glide across it. His hair was as wavy as Zed's was, too, but it was about the color of hot chocolate and cut much closer to his head. I assumed that this new person was Daniel, the other angel that Zed had mentioned. Daniel was flying at an incredibly fast rate, orange sparks lighting up his wings as he sped towards Zed. He was obviously running from something, but apart from the shadow-like creatures, I didn't see what it could be. Then, the clouds below him swelled, and an enormous dragon-like creature ascended from them. I didn't see how the monster could fly, because it didn't have any wings. Then I noticed all the shadow creatures holding it up. Despite that, the beast was terrifying. It was bigger than the average two-story house, its coal-black scales flashing in the sunlight. It had at least 20 heads, each of which had gleaming white fangs dripping with an evil-looking green liquid. Its claws were silver, and even from a distance I could tell that they were razor-sharp. It had a tail, too, extremely long with an equally sharp-looking, silver, mace-like appendage on the end. The most terrifying aspect of the dragon, though, was its glowing, blood-red eyes. Daniel turned around mid-flight and started shooting arrow after arrow from his golden bow, but the attacks didn't seem to do anything to the dragon except make it angrier. Zed raced forward to help, swinging his bow around to face the monster. Again and again the two angels bombarded the dragon with their arrows, but even with two of them, they weren't making any progress against it. The dragon, apparently deciding that it had had enough of the harassment, feigned a blow with one of its giant claws before ducking back underneath the clouds and heading towards the surface. The angels pursued it, flying down towards the storm clouds. Curiosity overwhelming my nervousness, I followed them. As soon as they broke the surface of the clouds, they were bombarded by high winds and heavy rain. I, on the other hand, was unaffected somehow. Despite the weather, they continued on, fighting to keep up with the dragon, which was surprisingly fast, even without wings. We followed the dragon into a spherical clearing in the storm, almost like a bubble, or the eye of a hurricane. I slowed down when we reached it, and I couldn't help but think that something didn't feel right. The dragon slowed down and suddenly went on the attack, spinning to face the two angels. Before they could react, all of the dragon's heads twisted together and formed a giant one, definitely the work of some kind of magic, and spewed a column of pure white fire from its now giant mouth. The two angels barely managed to dodge the column, sustaining minor burns from the pure heat of the inferno. The dragon, seeing an opening, started assaulting the two with the other weapons in its considerable arsenal. Zed barely managed to get away from its slashing claws, but wasn't fast enough to dodge the shaft of the thing's tail as it whipped around towards Daniel. With a crack that I heard over all the sounds of battle around me, Zed's wings seemed to bend in the wrong direction, the sound of the dragon roaring in triumph drowning out Zed's screams. Zed kept flying, but just barely, the purple sparks fading with every second. Daniel shouted something unintelligible at him, barely managing to keep the dragon at bay. Zed yelled something back, an unmistakable tightness to his voice, before flying up, out of the clearing, and eventually out of the storm. A majestic woman was fighting up there above the clouds, the very light seemingly bending to her will. It made the space around her glow, and drove any nearby storm clouds away. She was swinging around a golden staff topped with a crystal ball, glowing green energy copying her movements. A giant version of her staff struck hundreds of the shadow creatures at once, causing them to disintegrate. She had the same green energy working like a shield, protecting her from the shadow's counterattacks. Her hair was long and silver, flowing in the wind behind her, and her eyes were a pale blue, like robin eggs. Her face was pale and without blemish, her small nose and soft lips making her seem kind even in the midst of battle. She was wearing a Greek-style tunic with a golden sash, a matching golden tiara on her head.
"Go, Zed, you can't help us any longer. Get to safety!"
she bellowed, voice soft and yet commanding at the same time.
"But
go!" she yelled. Zed sped away, leaving a trail of feathers behind him. He kept going until it seemed he could fly no longer. Zed's injured wing went limp, and he screamed with a pain so intense that he blacked out. My dream faded away as he fell towards the ground. I jerked awake, covered in a cold sweat. It was a dream. Just a dream, I told myself breathlessly. For some reason, I didn't really believe that. It had been too lifelike. But then, what else could it possibly be? I sighed and dismissed the thought, looking up at my bed and expecting to see Zed. But he'd already left. The window was open, letting the warm summer morning air flow into the room. I got up, stretched, and reached across my bed to shut the window. I unlocked the door, too, just in case my parents came to check on me. I didn't want to look suspicious. Then I crossed back over to my bed, which had been neatly made with a note left on the pillow. Well, isn't he polite? I thought. I don't even make my bed this well. I couldn't help but smile as I imagined him folding the blankets while trying to avoid waking me up. Then I picked up the note and flipped it open, cringing as I examined his handwriting. This is a rough translation. Carolyn, I have an idea on how to contact Lestraussa. You should know her 'cause of your book. Will you be back tonight if you'll have me? Decided not to try any more magic. Sorry if my English is bad. Zed. I have an idea on how to contact Lestrausa. You should know her because of your book. I'll be back tonight if you'll have me. I decided not to try any more magic. Sorry if my English is bad. I read silently, automatically correcting his grammar mistakes. Even though there wasn't anything special about what he said, I could feel my face flushing, and my heart started racing. I placed the note in the first drawer of my desk, silently resolving to tape it into my diary later. Then I got dressed, pulling on a pair of light gray capris and a turquoise tank top. I walked over to the full-length mirror on my wall to do my hair, automatically critiquing my appearance as us girls are prone to do. In the mirror, my dark brown eyes moved slightly as I examined my round face, hesitating as they passed over my straight and slightly larger than average nose, thin, pale pink lips, and bushy, slightly arched eyebrows. My average-sized hands ran over my lightly tanned skin, and I couldn't help but pinch my slightly chubby cheeks. Maybe I should start wearing makeup, I considered, noting the few small pimples on my forehead. No, too much of a hassle, and I don't really see the point of it anyway. If I want someone to like me, they should like me for who I am. Then I picked up the brush I'd left on my dresser and ran it through my short, straight, and sort of puffy, bronze-colored hair. It was uninteresting and barely reached my shoulders, where it hung pathetically, split ends tangled in a bedhead that would bring bird nests everywhere to shame. By the time I was done with it, it was at least acceptable. Putting the brush down, I looked over my athletic frame one last time, wishing, and not for the first time, that I was 5 or 6 pounds lighter. However, my above-average height and decent muscle tone made up for it. Confident that I was at least presentable, I exited my room and headed into the kitchen for breakfast. Mom was cooking this morning, making the only breakfast she knew how to, French toast. Dad was at his usual station at the computer, where he usually managed his stocks, watched karate videos, or played the occasional video game. He was always told that he looked like a retired sergeant major. His hair was brown, like mine, and was styled in a military buzz cut. He had brown eyes, also like mine, that had lines around the edges, so you could tell that he smiled a lot. Mom and I looked so much alike that we sometimes got mistaken for each other. Our hair, our broad shoulders and athletic body types, even our demeanors were practically identical. The only real difference between us was that her eyes were blue, and I was maybe an inch taller.
Good morning, Pumpkin,
Mom called cheerfully as I entered the room. Ever since I was a little kid, Mom always called me her pumpkin pie. Strange, sure, but I was okay with it. My family's situation was kind of weird, when you consider the average American family. Mom is the one that works, instead of Dad. She's a colonel in the army. Because of that, we moved every 2 or 3 years, even living overseas at times. It's tough, moving to a new place every 2 or 3 years. I've never really fit into any clique at school as a result, unless you count people that never get noticed. Or maybe it's because I was a little different from the average kid. I'd been maintaining straight A's for 3 or 4 years in a row, and I was infamous for winning the town's local essay and poetry contests. You'd think that that was a good thing, but other kids tend to look at you differently if they think you're some sort of genius. I guess I've just never really fit in. I have the feeling that Zed feels the same way. I must have been staring into space, because Dad came over to the kitchen table and started waving his hand in front of my face.
What you thinking about, Scooter?
He asked. Dad, on the other hand, always called me Scooter. Don't ask me why. Oh, nothing important, I said, still deep in thought. He looked at me funny, and I could tell he didn't believe me. Breakfast was uneventful, probably because my brother had left early to go and play with his friends. Afterwards, I went back into my room and took the book off of my shelf again. Let's see. Zed mentioned a goddess named Lestrausa in his note. I carefully flipped through the pages until I found the name. The picture on the page was incredibly realistic, and I recognized it instantly. It was the woman that was fighting in my dream, the one with the golden staff. Lady Lestrausa, huh? I said thoughtfully. Zed said that she's the goddess of all light and goodness, or something like that. I really wanted to translate the page, to see if it would help me figure out my dream. Zed said that he's going to explain the book to me. I shouldn't do it without him, I thought reluctantly, closing the book with a thump. I replaced the book on its shelf and went to find Dad. As usual, I found him on the computer, looking at something over the top of his square glasses. "Hey Dad, I'm going on a walk, okay?" I asked. I had to do something other than sit around the house all day, waiting for Zed. I'd go stir-crazy.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
He said. I headed out the door and started walking around the neighborhood. At the time, my family and I lived on a military fort in Arizona, Fort Huachuca, a small military intelligence center nestled at the base of the Huachuca Mountains. It was one of the most boring places I'd ever lived. All the on-post facilities were small and outdated, and the biggest attraction in Sierra Vista, the town the fort was located in, was its one-story mall. It was nearly always sunny, except for the summers, when the monsoon season came and flooded everything. The thunder there was especially loud, because it was amplified by the mountains. Sometimes the ground would even shake. Huachuca means thunder, in the language of the Indians that used to live there hundreds of years ago. Speaking of rainy days, I've always loved them. The sound of rain and the overcast skies helped me concentrate on some of my favorite pastimes, reading, writing, and video games. Anyway, the sky was definitely overcast that day, but it wasn't raining. Yet. I headed to the little park on the other side of the neighborhood to pass the time. Once I reached it, I was happy to see that it was empty. No competition for the swings. I sat on one of them and looked up at the mountains, wondering what it would be like to fly. I could leave this place whenever I wanted, leave for a day and go to Phoenix, come back before anyone noticed. I thought I saw a black speck at the top of the mountain with the cliff, the one that I jumped off of in my dreams. As I watched, a purple beam of light erupted from the speck, shooting off into the sky for a split second before disappearing again. "Zed," I whispered under my breath. He must have gotten up really early to get all the way up there. I stayed at the park for another half hour or so, waiting to see if Zed would do anything else, and enjoying the breeze. When nothing else out of the ordinary happened, I went back home, not knowing what else to do. For the rest of the day, I did nothing but alternate between playing video games and staring off into space. A waste of time, I know. Finally, the sun started its slow descent over the horizon, streaks of orange, purple, and red appearing in the sky. I turned away from my room's window and picked up one of the Greek mythology books lying around my room. I didn't want to be quite as clueless when Zed came back. Even before Zed fell from the sky, I liked reading the ancient myths about gods and goddesses. I never had any reason to believe them, though, until now. I must have read longer than I thought, because soon there was a knock at the window. I looked up and saw Zed standing there, drenched in sweat, with the sweatshirt I gave him tied around his waist. He was practically shaking with exhaustion, but he still smiled at me as I slid open the window. I smiled back. It seemed impossible not to. He struggled into the room and crashed onto my bed once he cleared the window pane. "You may want to be more careful," I said once he'd sat on the bed across from me. "I saw you on top of the mountain. That was you, wasn't it?"
Aw, you're worried about me,
he teased. I shook my head and frowned in mock anger. "What were you trying to do, anyway?" I asked.
Well, since the magical sound transmitting technique doesn't seem to be working, I created a beacon to try and signal Straussa.
He said despondently, studying his hands.
As you can see, it didn't work.
"Do you think she has a reason for not responding?" I asked.
I don't know.
He said sadly. "Maybe it's not safe to go back yet," I said, remembering my dream. Could the battle still be going on? He shook his head.
They could at least contact me. They could use the magical sound transmitting technique to send me a message, but that's blocked for some reason. Ostrausa could send Daniel or one of her troops, she could create a portal back to Empyrean, and there are hundreds of other ways to reach me.
Unless there wasn't anyone left to try. I pushed the thought away and decided to ask him about the dream I had last night. "Hey Zed," I asked nervously. He looked at me, and I continued. "I had this, dream last night about how you crash-landed in my yard. I started awkwardly. You and another angel that looked just like you were fighting a bunch of monsters. One in particular. He started nodding.
And I got hit in the wing by it?
He prompted. Yeah.
People sometimes get dreams like that when you sleep close by a magical source,
he told me.
Since you were probably wondering how I got hurt in the first place, that's what you saw.
I was amazed that the dream was true, but I got over it quickly. Something tells me that things like this are going to be happening a lot, I realized. What was it that you were chasing?
The bringer of death, one of Hades' most terrible monsters,
he said. Hades is the god of the underworld, right? I asked. But why would one of his monsters attack another god?
You have to understand something about the gods. They're not peaceful. They wage wars against each other all the time, and they usually drag the lesser mortals and humans into them. Hades is one of the most bloodthirsty of the gods. Thousands of years ago, he tried to steal the throne from Zeus and take over Empyrean. Daniel managed to stop him and killed him.
I thought the gods were immortal, I asked.
They are, in a way. They don't die exactly, but go into something called a regenerative state. They remain in the underworld for a few millennia, while their bodies recover from whatever trauma was sustained. Anyway, the bringer of death only acts on Hades' orders, so it should still be sleeping in the underworld, like its master,
he said. How come the bringer of death isn't in the myths? Did Zeus hide that too? I asked.
No, the ancient Greeks mistook it for a giant hydra. Those things are nasty,
Zed said. Oh, but if Hades is still regenerating, then how did it get to the surface? I asked.
The only way the bringer of death could have gotten to the surface is if Hades is alive again. But that's impossible. It usually takes a god tens of thousands of years to regenerate, and it's only been 4,000. He couldn't possibly have regenerated that fast.
Something told me he was reassuring himself more than me.